So we go out through this field, and I'm standing kind of on a road above it a little bit, looking out on this field, and they start lining up and handing out tiki torches. And then they light them all in unison, and suddenly you can see it's a massive line of white nationalists, like with lit torches, all sneaking through this field.
It's the Lawfare podcast. I'm Katherine Pompilio, associate editor of Lawfare, with Elle Reeve, correspondent at CNN who covers right-wing extremism and the alt-right.
But January 6th was like grown-ups, elders, people who clearly had jobs, like people who were wearing nice winter coats, people who could be like my aunts, you know, and just seeing them so possessed by these ideas that I didn't feel like they even understood the origins of.
Today, we're talking about Reeve's book entitled Black Pill: How I Witnessed the Darkest Corners of the Internet Come to Life, Poison Society, and Capture American Politics. To get us situated, what is your elevator pitch for this book? What is it about?
I mean, originally I was like, I want the subtitle to be, why did all this crazy stuff happen? The elevator pitch is how, like, a very obscure, small part of the internet created a very powerful culture that eventually took over all of politics. It spiraled up and up and up and stepped out of just the internet world into the real world repeatedly. Charlottesville, January 6th, two events I was at.
Yeah. What made you want to write the book?
It was just after Jan 6th. I had been standing by the White House watching Rudy Giuliani give a speech about how we were going to have a trial by combat. And there was a man in front of me, you know, in his 50s, wearing chainmail. And he's so thrilled by what Giuliani was saying. He's like, yeah, trial by combat, I'm ready. And he was wearing a Pepe the Frog shirt. And Pepe the Frog had been this alt-right symbol that was like a huge part of my reporting life, like in 2016 and 2017. And I was like, do you know where that comes from? He says, oh, well, it was made by someone back in the day. I was just like, so much of what had brought people to January 6th was created by these guys I had been following for 10 years, and they had no idea.
That's absolutely wild, and I cannot wait to dive into that. So also just super broadly, the book builds off of your really personal interactions with various alt-right figures. Can you talk a little bit about your research, how you turn that into writing, and what is it like building relationships with these people? And frankly, how do you do it?
Yeah, I started covering the alt-right really in 2016, and it was very difficult because it is a very hostile movement to reporters. It is a movement that thinks lying is an acceptable tool for their activism, and it is extremely misogynistic because it was very heavily influenced by incel culture. So at the beginning, it was extremely hard. I mean, I had a lot of false starts. I mean, I would just call people and they would scream racial slurs at me, and that's it. And I wouldn't get anything out of them. But sometimes, you know, I'd let them yell at me for 10 minutes or 30 minutes, and then they'd start telling me their life story. Because no matter how extreme someone is, almost everyone I've ever met wants to tell their story. They want it to be recorded for history. They want their lives to be meaningful. And even someone calling for peaceful ethnic cleansing, like something that hateful, they still think what they're doing is good and that they're affecting history. So, you know, just having incredible patience and sticking around for a long time until I became an accepted part of the surroundings in that world. In 2021, like the main figures of the alt-right went on trial for their role in Charlottesville. Mm-hmm. And it was like a 4-week trial, and they were really forced to confront what they'd done. They had to look at all the evidence, the communications. They'd had to go through and defend everything that built up to that day. And it put them in a very reflective mood. And I was able to talk to them, and after that, talk to them for hours and hours and hours about what they'd done. Over time, again, there's a mutual respect that develops. Like, obviously what I think they're doing is very bad for the world and bad for their own families. And I say that to them. But the hostility melts away.
Wow. It's, I guess a person-to-person connection, even though under all of that.
Yeah. It can be a little thing like, oh,
Yeah.
we're both left-handed. How about that?
So throughout the book, one central figure is Fred. We keep coming back to Fred. Who is Fred, and why do we keep coming back to him to tell his story?
Frederick Brennan was a brilliant teenager who had a very difficult disability, osteogenesis imperfecta. It means his bones are very brittle, so he can't, like, a very small amount of movement can cause them to break. He said that he's had more than 100 breaks in his life, and there's some bones that are never going to heal. So he had a very difficult situation. He was taken from his parents. He was in foster care. He was very angry at the world, but he was really good at computers. His dad had given him a computer when he was a little kid. So he had this feeling that like words were this ultimate weapon he could use against other people. Like he realized he could say, there was nothing he couldn't say. He could say the meanest possible things to infuriate or insult his caregivers, because if they struck him, they could kill him maybe, or hurt him very badly. They would go to jail. So it was almost like his total vulnerability was an invincibility shield. So he's a very angry young man, and he's in foster care, and he gets on 4chan and he starts asking, why is my life like this? Why was this allowed to happen? Why am I this kid who can't play outside, trapped in foster care? Like, why is it like this? And the people he's asking that question to are already often neo-Nazis on 4chan. And their answer is because your mother was allowed to breed, that people with disabilities should not be allowed to breed. And now, of course, he knows that that's wrong. But at the time, that was compelling to him. So eventually he started this website, 8chan, a more wild version of 4chan. And that became a platform where, for a lot of the alt-right, wild anti-Semitism and hateful harassment campaigns, Gamergate, QAnon, mass shooters posted their manifestos there. Eventually he realized he'd created a monster and did take active steps to try to kill that monster.
That's wild.
He's just like he has a very distinct view of the world. He's a very deep thinker. He's like an incredible person to talk to, like I've always enjoyed talking to people like that more than a politician. A politician comes there in his suit and they say a banality and expect you to almost applaud for them. Well, this guy has this very unique perspective on life. Yeah. And he did things that were wrong and he knows that were wrong, but also his view is very illuminating for us living in the normal world.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we really dive in, I want to get some terminology straight, because I consider myself to be chronically online, and even sometimes I had to find myself go back and rereading. So what are the pills? What's red pill, black pill? Yeah, the pills. What do they mean?
Yeah, red pilled. I think a lot of people know red pilled by now. I mean, this really got going around the first Trump campaign, but the idea comes from the Matrix. So Keanu Reeves is presented the red pill and the blue pill. The blue pill, he lives in the pleasant illusion created by the machines. The red pill, he learns the truth. He's stripped of his illusions and he sees that humans are slaves to the machines. So that idea has taken off, especially on the right-wing internet, to take the red pill. Like, it's not to take on a different ideology, like in this way of thinking. The idea is that you're being stripped of your illusions. Like, you're just seeing the truth. Which is, of course, not true. It's its own set of ideas, but that's not the way they see it. And then from that became all these other pills, like pill becomes slang. Like, are you crypto pilled? Are you Russia pilled? It can be a term of derision, a term of pride, somewhere in between, green pilled, whatever. There's a wild comment called iron pill. But I think black pilled is the most important one because it's not even about ideas. It's about a feeling of gleeful nihilism, that all of this is corrupt. It's hopeless. Like, society is irredeemable. And so the best thing you can possibly do is accelerate towards its destruction. Becomes what comes after will be a golden era. You can remake the world the way it ought to be. And with black pilled thinking, you can rationalize a lot of immoral and unethical actions because the morals and ethics created by this society are totally bankrupt. Like, why should you have to follow them?
Scary.
Yeah.
So you begin chapter 2 with a discussion of what you say is the loosely connected group of people working to make America more racist.
Yeah.
And you explain that you like to use the term Nazis, lowercase n, to define this group. Why do you use this term specifically as compared to white supremacist or white nationalist?
White nationalist, that was actually a PR term that they came up with like in the 90s because they didn't want to be called white supremacists anymore. Now, so like whatever is associated with him, eventually that word becomes toxic no matter how they try to shape the PR around it. But Nazi to me just is like the generic drug, right? It's not neo-Nazis of the 90s. It's not the German Nazis of the 30s. It's like, and the reality is this is also what they sometimes refer to themselves as, like in their texts between each other, in their sexts, which became public as part of that federal civil trial, you know?
Oof.
Richard Spencer texted a woman saying, when you're America's number one Nazis, there's nothing more alpha than that. Like they really reveled in it. This was like really interesting and difficult to, like as a journalist, I'm reporting on it, but I'm talking to people who, you know, my editors, et cetera, they're disconnected from it. So they're nervous about calling them racist, calling them Nazis, whatever. And I have to be like, no, they call themselves racist.
Yeah.
They call themselves Nazis. Like they embrace it.
It's a badge of honor.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just weird to think about. And those inside this camp call it a movement. Who's at the center of this movement? I know you mentioned Richard Spencer, and who are the vampires as you describe in the book? Yeah.
So the white power movement, we can call it that. The white power movement has been around a long time. The sort of modern era is dated to the 60s. George Lincoln Rockwell would give these campus speeches where he would be heckled. And like the more wild the students got, the more he liked it, because eventually he could get them to listen. And I think that was very influential on this movement going all the way forward. And you see the trolling potential back in these grainy audio recordings from the 60s. But starting in about the 2000s, they felt like their movement was dead in the Bush era. Most of the people involved were really old, or there were skinheads who seemed like cartoonish. They were called Hollywood Nazis. So this guy, Bill Regnery, created the Charles Martel Society, and it was a secret society that was meant to sort of cultivate the white nationalist movement and help bring forward new, younger leaders. They had a really hard time up into the Bush era recruiting young people. So most people involved were like super old. Like Matt Heimbach told me the story about joining a concerned citizens council and people saying like, oh, is your grandpa involved in this? Like, why are you doing this? But around the mid-Obama era, all of that changed. That's when the alt-right came online. And that was a very different thing born on 4chan and anonymous message boards, where making ironic racist jokes kind of shifted into making sincere racist jokes, into it being like a full-on ideology. Richard Spencer, he'd been cultivated by the Charles Martel Society. His patron was Bill Regnery, who he called vampires. He calls all these men vampires now. He says they try to suck the blood and the life out of anything that is alive and vital. So Spencer had created this term alt-right, then kind of abandoned it because he's always beefing with people. But the 4chan, like the little anonymous trolls on 4chan, often truly teenagers, they adopted the term. They created their culture and their whole ideology around it. They created all of this slang. And as it started to rise in 2014, 2015, Spencer saw that and tried to sort of surf on top of it. Because Spencer was willing to use his real name and his real face, like reporters could talk to him the way they couldn't talk to an anonymous troll. So he became the face of the movement, even though he didn't actually have control of it.
And did he understand it, or was he just kind of riding a wave?
In retrospect, he says he just did not understand it, as do the other younger leaders of his generation.
Yeah.
That they thought they had this massive populist movement swelling behind them, but really it was an entirely different animal.
All of a sudden, this cartoon frog appears and It's your symbol. Can you talk a little bit about that? what did this new influx of alt-right people bring to the movement? You meant like new
They brought
memes.
youth, vitality, a punk rock sensibility, a feeling of being countercultural. I mean, you see this even now. Like so many of the comedians are sort of right coded. Maybe they're not explicitly Trump supporters, but like Joe Rogan.
Mm-hmm.
But they made, or they were trying to make racism cool and bigotry and misogyny. Like, and Trump was a really great, like, icon of that. Like they didn't think that Trump was one of them, but he had this like swaggering macho sensibility within the troll world. Like if you complain about your mistreatment, you're a loser. And like the most epic troll is like, the meanest person online is the coolest guy in these communities, right? And Trump is like an excellent shit talker. Like he's a master shit talker. He's almost like an insult comic. So he was a perfect icon for that.
Ugh, yeah. Even though he didn't fit, I guess, exactly the way they wanted him to, or
They thought of him as a useful tool. And that it was like kind of funny and ironic to be for him because he made all the people that they didn't like angry. So Matt Heimbach described to me, like on election night when Trump won, that the feeling was better than sex. Not because Trump won, but because all the people he hated were so upset about it.
Wow. So you keep mentioning Matt Heimbach, and who's Matt Heimbach and who's Matt Parrott? You talk a lot about them throughout the book as well. Why are they important?
Matt Heimbach and Matt Parrott, two friends or frenemies who were a big part of the white nationalist movement for 10 years. Parrott was 10 years older than him. Matt Heimbach was like, in like 2013, he was like a young hotshot of being racist. He got a lot of attention creating a white students council on campus at Towson University. So they met at these white nationalist conferences, and they were very frustrated with the white nationalist movement because they thought it was basically, get together, have your conference, say racist stuff, but then just vote Republican. And they thought that they wanted a broader welfare state. They wanted more support for white families. Like you can really see the influence of this today. Their slogan was faith, family, and folk. Folk being white people. And their idea is they wanted to create like a stronger community of white people working together, more socialist in that way. I mean, they were truly fascists. And instead of providing a little bit of support for, Republican tax cuts or war in Iraq or that kind of thing, Heimbach comes to live with Parrott, who Parrott had married a much older woman, and so he became a stepfather at 21 of a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old girl. So by the time he's 30, Heimbach is in his early 20s, as are these stepdaughters. So Heimbach marries one of them. So they become not just partners in racism, they also become in-laws. And they have this like very difficult like push and pull, like almost like this, like a Shakespearean relationship. Eventually, Heimbach has an affair with Parrott's, one of his wives. So he's technically having an affair with his stepmother-in-law. They get caught. There's a fist fight that breaks out. He's arrested. And that was the end of their Traditionalist Workers' Party. That was in 2018. But eventually they came together again. It's like some of their only friends in the world. Like once you join this movement, like you're poison to the outside world. And it's very hostile inside. Like there's a lot of people with mental illness. It's like, it's kind of a terrible place to live, but you can't leave. It just traps you forever. So these guys, like they had this horrible affair. It became news, like they're humiliated in public, but they have to get back together to defend themselves against this lawsuit. And it's just their lives are bound forever.
That is so Shakespearean.
It's just wild in there. So those were two of the younger leaders who were around before this like online alt-right wave. And they were rivals of Spencer, who they thought was like a snooty fancy boy. They were considered more like working class, low class. They were trashy. This is called bad optics, within the white nationalist movement, while Spencer was considered good optics because he's like fancy, he like wore 3-piece suits, he seems like an intellectual. Really, all of them are middle class, all of them. But there's like a lot of shame about being middle class. So you either pretend to be an aristocrat or you pretend to be working class. They all, Heimbach and Parrott wore Dickies. The symbol of their movement was like a gear and like a plow. Like they pretended to be workers and farmers. You kind of see this now on the left, right? There's like this working class face.
Yeah.
But in reality, he's just a guy from the suburbs.
With a brother who makes Disney videos.
That's right. Yes. Yes.
On
Matt
YouTube.
Heimbach.
Yeah.
Yeah. Matt Heimbach, his brother reviews Disney theme parks for a living. Heimbach sent me a video of it, which he sees as like the pinnacle of capitalist, like slop. Like the meagerness of American culture when it's driven by corporate capitalism, right? So he sends me a link to one of those videos and he's like, I can't tell if he's the evil one or I'm the evil one. And it's like, it's like you did fascism, you're the evil
You're
one.
the evil one, Matt.
Sorry, you're the evil one.
And then in your discussion of these two and the larger movement, you say that Parrott and Heimbach refer to themselves and one another as autists.
Yeah.
And I know you offer many qualifiers throughout the book, like, autism does not mean that you are more likely to, commit violence or be in these groups. But why do they refer to themselves as autistic? Are they actually autistic, or do they just call themselves this to categorize themselves as an other or not a normie, as they would say?
So with Heimbach and Parrott, they both were diagnosed with Asperger's in the 90s as children. That's no longer in the DSM. It's just all considered part of autism spectrum disorder. So Heimbach, though, his mom was a teacher. He took a lot of behavioral training. Like he basically had remedial social skills classes. So he learned how to have conversations, how to be charming, how a conversation was like a tennis game where you lob the ball back and forth, even if you think the other person is kind of boring. And so Parrott saw him as like the perfect face of the movement because Parrott described him as autistically social, that he approached socialization with an autistic obsessiveness in order to sort of perfect his performance. Even if you're looking at his hands, he's like fidgeting and tearing up a little napkin because he has so much social anxiety. Within 4chan, like this was one of the first things I noticed about the alt-right movement was how often this term came up, autist, A-U-T-I-S-T. In those anonymous spaces, I can't actually find out, like, were you diagnosed? So it's not clear. A lot of them talk about being diagnosed, but in general, what appeals to them is this idea that they're highly intelligent, but they lack the social skills to operate normally in society, and especially they lack the skills to get a girlfriend. That one of the older, less offensive pieces of slang that came out of this was to have spaghetti fall out of your pockets. Meaning like you go and you try to have a social interaction and you humiliate yourself so badly, it feels as though spaghetti has fallen out of your pockets. This is, again, like heavily influenced by incel culture, the idea. So incels, a lot of people have heard by now about Chad. He's this sort of mythical, handsome man who gets all the girls. Chad tells you to just be yourself because Chad being himself has worked so well with women. But the incels and the autists, they feel like if they are themselves, they will turn off anyone they talk to. I did speak to Rachel Lofton. She examined Dylan Roof in his sentencing. And diagnosed him as autistic. She said that he had approached racism with an autistic intensity. And she couldn't talk to me about him specifically, but she said that she advised parents of autistic children to severely limit internet time because extremist communities can be very appealing to them because, one, they offer a rigid, clear view of the world and how it operates. It's rules that are understandable. Two, they can communicate with other people without social anxiety because they're doing it through the screen. And 3, because there's archives of these message boards, they can go back and see how people interacted and mimic those interactions. You know, if someone says, "How was your weekend?" You say it was great. You know, like the small talk that most people do naturally, like they could learn through these archives. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what percent is actually autistic, but a massive percent of them identify in that way.
Got it. Okay, kind of switching gears a little bit. What is Gamergate and why is it significant?
Gamergate always like gives me a headache when I have to talk about.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Gamergate started with a guy claiming falsely that his ex-girlfriend had traded sex for a positive review of her video game. Like the review was never even published. Like this didn't happen. Mm-hmm. But that sparked this kind of online movement of people who were obsessed with video games. And they were coordinated on 4chan and then later 8chan. And these were white guys who felt like they had made the video game industry what it was, and they didn't like having diversity and like women's rights forced down their throat. They didn't want to be scolded about that the video game girls had their boobs were too big. Like they didn't want to be yelled at about that. They wanted their video games to be the way they were. So they harassed a lot of women involved in the video game industry who protested about this. They coordinated like advertiser boycotts of Gawker and for the way that they covered Gamergate, and it was quite effective. The movement was kicked off 4chan, and Fred Brennan then marketed his website, 8chan, to the Gamergaters. He was like, you can come in. He did this through a man who named Mark Mann, who lives in Brooklyn in a home for autistic adults. So Mark Mann marketed all these like video game influencers. He's like, come over to 8chan. You can harass whoever you want to here. And that's what grew 8chan into a huge site. And so Fred sort of lorded over this. He wasn't really into video games at all or the movement, but he took the opportunity to create this persona for himself as this internet supervillain.
And can you talk a bit about like the behavior or culture on 8chan or other extremist forums? Why is the general idea be more cruel than the next guy? And how does that contribute to that?
So I think the people who have the best insight into this are the few ex-girlfriends or women who are in that world. One woman I spoke to, I call her Anna in the book, she said that these spaces reward cruelty, that a lot of times these are guys who are bullied or even abused, and they are replicating that mistreatment, that they are trying to mimic men that they've seen dominate women. There's also this phenomenon, Natalie Wynn, she goes by ContraPoints on YouTube, has talked about. It's like within digital self-harm, the idea that whatever hurts is true. And people will kind of seek out the most painful comments and like the more painful they are to read, the more you want to believe them. In incel forums, these guys would post videos of their faces, and they believe, of course, that they're too ugly to ever have a relationship. And the other incels will come in and just brutally criticize what they look like and make fun of them. And the original poster will just like eat this up. Like it's actually like it's a really dark, sick place. And people involved in it, they harass other people. Like they do bad actions. I'm not saying they're like innocent victims here, but they are trapped in a very toxic world that is very painful to leave. One guy I talked to who'd been in an incel Discord for a decade was like, he said that, you're chatting in these rooms for a long time. You'll eventually let like little secrets about your life slip out. And collectively, the group, the room will remember that. And then whenever you piss someone off, disagreeing with them about politics or whatever, someone will say like, hey, but like, didn't your girlfriend break up with you? Aren't you really fat? Weren't you molested as a child? Nothing is off limits didn't your parents die in a fire? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, and so the result is that all day long, it's like having a speaker next to your ear, replaying the worst moments of your life. And yet they're addicted to it. They can't leave. They spend, one guy I talked to would go like a full day without sleeping. He just live inside these chat rooms.
Wow.
It just really warps their idea of what's normal in the world, how normal people relate to each other. I mean, they're extremely cruel to the people that they sort of consider friends.
Yeah, and how are you supposed to get out of that if it's all you hear all the
Yeah, and it's all
time?
you know. And then you try to interact in the normal world and you come across as a huge asshole.
Yeah. And it's confirmation. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
well, everybody's right online.
And,
Yeah.
and then people reject you, right?
Yeah.
Because you're such an asshole. And so you just keep going back into your digital world.
One of the chapters that I found to be the most compelling, especially given, everything we've talked about now and everything you've written about in terms of the hatred of women and talk about women specifically on these forums and in these movements. Why do women join these movements? How do they get involved? And what's their reasoning?
Yeah, it's like super dark. So one woman I spoke to, almost all of the ones that I spoke to had some kind of trauma in their past, some much worse than others. One woman I spoke to, she started on her own going into incel forums because she really liked the idea of ugliness. She said that she had been sexually abused and she started to feel like if she had been ugly, it wouldn't have happened to her. And she said that she could almost depersonalize and not think of herself as a woman when they were saying these horrible things. Or alternatively, like there was almost like a freedom or a release in believing that as a woman, like you're stupid, you exist for sex, like you're sort of like a lower life form. Like it's easier to believe that, she said, than to believe that someone that you like or love or respect is mistreating you. Other women, they came to the alt-right through YouTube usually. Several came in because they liked Richard Spencer, and not because of this racist stuff he said. They liked the way he talked about protecting families. They found it very appealing, this idea of women being protected and respected for doing feminine things, right? Instead of thinking like cooking and cleaning and just being beautiful and raising children, that's lesser or stupid or unintellectual, that in a way that's venerated. At least that's the pitch. Now that's not the reality once you're inside. Once you're inside, these women were treated terribly and with awful disrespect. And, one woman, I became a meme in 2017, the concept of white Sharia. It was their idea of Sharia law that like women would be second-class citizens, no divorce, no jobs, no voting, child marriages, right? Rape being okay. That the only way to create the world they wanted in America was to strip women of the right to vote. So they called this white Sharia. And it started as a joke. And as with so much of this stuff, it started to become real. They started to live that way. This woman started showing up in a hijab at alt-right parties. Her boyfriend treated her terribly, spit on her in front of other people. She would be, I should just to back up for a second, I got my hands on a woman's phone that she'd used when she was a white nationalist, Samantha Froelich. She quit, and that phone remained offline, unspoiled by Wi-Fi. And so I got the screen fixed. I go into it, and I'm reading all these different chat threads. I'm living her life through these the many different Samanthas that exist in all these different relationships. And one of them is with that woman who wore the burqa. And that woman would tell her how much she loved her boyfriend, how much fun they were having, what a cool, fun guy he sounded like on his podcasts. He was such a stud, the way he talked about rape and impregnating women. And then late at night, the texts would turn and she would say, I've been dehumanized enough for one weekend. I've been crying in the car for 2 hours. These men are so horrible. Do not trust these men. I'll never respect myself again. I can't be around other men who know how I let my boyfriend treat me. And that would go late into the night. And then the next morning, she'd be sending a link to a burqa on Amazon. And I had read about how women in abusive relationships, how it takes many, many times to actually leave your abuser, how difficult it is to get out of the mental headspace that you deserve this treatment, and that he's really a good man. But I saw it play out in these text messages. And that woman left when she got pregnant.
Wow.
She didn't want, I'm told, her kid to be treated that way.
That's really sad and dark.
But all these women, even in front of other women in a group chat, they would say oh, I didn't, these guys, I didn't get the jokes at first. They were memeing so hard. I thought it was kind of offensive. But then I've learned that they're just joking and this is how they're going to grow the movement. And I don't take it so personally. But then privately, one-on-one, they're I am afraid of this man. I can't, one texted Samantha saying, I cannot in good conscience make any more propaganda to lure in women to a movement that hates them.
Wow.
And I just want to say, the old school white nationalist, this full on neo-Nazi. I interviewed Jeff Scoop, full on wearing reinforced knuckles. He has a huge scar on the back of his head from getting hit with a tire iron. Tough guy. We'll just put it that way. He had done this for 30 years. He'd known people who'd killed people. He'd known a family annihilator. But when the alt-right came online, it was so misogynistic. He's whoa, okay, this is too weird.
That's where I draw the line.
I can't deal with these guys. This shit's too weird for me.
Oh my God. Yeah, I remember that in your book. And I have it highlighted. I could talk about this forever, but to cover all the bases, the book also details your experience at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. Could you just talk about, your experience there? When did you realize what was happening and what were you thinking?
Yeah. I knew it was going to be big going into it because every single white nationalist I interviewed, I reached out to, even trolls, they all knew about it and thought it was really cool. It was supposed to be the climax of what they called the Summer of Hate. There'd been these street brawls that were escalating in size and violence between leftists and the alt-right all that year. And this was supposed to be the big one. And so I just knew I had to go. And my bosses are you have to get an interview if you want to, you have to interview someone. So I reached out and this guy called me Chris Cantwell. He later became known as the Crying Nazi. And so we arranged to have an interview there. And we met in a public park, and he had about 24 of his little fans around him. And immediately, you could feel they had confidence, but also it was very menacing. Even I have been studying these guys for a while. Even I am swayed by the feeling of I don't want to admit that I've been, quote, trolled or that I am feeling any feelings, but it was crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to interview this guy and he's trying to provoke me and repeatedly drawing attention to the fact that I am female.
Yeah.
And all these guys around him are heckling and jeering. And, one of the cameramen overheard a guy being oh, she's doing all the stereotypical female stuff. They were very obsessed with my voice being high, but I don't have that high a voice.
Yeah.
I am a woman.
Yeah.
I am a woman. My voice is not as deep as a man's. That's just reality.
Yeah.
So from that, the tension, the potential energy, right, that you knew was going to turn into kinetic energy, you could feel that it was very thick with that. And one of my colleagues overheard them saying that there would be something at Nameless Field that night at 9:30. I knew something was happening at night, but I didn't know what. And we were what's Nameless Field? Well, there must be some kind of code. No, there's a field at UVA called Nameless Field. We Google it. And so we just go to it. And there are all these vans, white vans, dropping these guys off at this field in white polos. You could tell immediately that it was very, very well organized. This wasn't just kind of thrown together, everyone just show up. There had been a lot of planning. So we go out through this field and I'm standing kind of on a road above it a little bit, looking out on this field, and they start lining up and handing out tiki torches. And then they light them all in unison. And suddenly you can see it's a massive line of white nationalists, like with lit torches, all sneaking through this field. And that was when I was like, oh my God, like, I mean, I would like, that was when you could see the size and seriousness of it as a movement. Like, this is a lot of people in a college town on a summer weekend. That was when I was like, oh my, are they going to win? That was the question that was in my head. Like, are they going to really seize the government with these ideas? So then they start marching. They were only supposed to march for 5 minutes, but I found out later they went the wrong way. Like, this wasn't planned. So they went the opposite direction. So they're marching all through campus for like 45 minutes and amping themselves up. Like in covering this world, like, I've truly learned what mob mentality is, like, in a way that I didn't understand before. Like, you can feel the human emotion. It's like electric moving through the crowd. They're like whooping and hollering. And they had a list of chants that they thought would be good PR. You will not replace us. But they got so excited, they said Jews will not replace us, which is what they really believed, the great replacement conspiracy theory. And that was really important for us to capture, because before that, it had been up for grabs what the alt-right was. Was it truly a racist movement or an anti-Semitic movement? Like, Steve Bannon had talked about it. He's like, yeah, there's some anti-Semites in it, but, that's not what it is as a whole, right? There were like regular conservatives who wanted a piece of it until Charlottesville. So yeah, and like the cops didn't even show up. Like, this like march ends in this massive melee, this enormous brawl. We lost our cameraman in it. Like, I stood on top of this little column, like trying to find them. We'd like lost them in the crowd until it all started to disperse.
Oh my God.
It was insane, and the cops didn't show up until it was over. Like, it really was a feeling like they could do whatever they wanted. Like, this was going to be their town for the weekend. Yeah, so that night, I suppose, was when I realized it'd be big. It was the next day. The next day, that's the day of the march. It was Saturday, August 12th. I mean, again, all those guys know my name.
Mm-hmm.
They all were familiar with my coverage and had obsessively like researched my boyfriends and all kinds of things about me. I have catchphrases to them. I mean, I'm a meme to them. So when I would walk through the crowd, they'd be like, oh, that's that bitch from Vice. Or they'd be like, oh, hello, Elle. Like, that's interesting.
Oof.
Like, that's what I say, when I'm talking to them, and I don't want to say, oh, cool idea, dude. I say, oh, interesting. So that, like, I experienced it a little differently than your average person, because everywhere I walked, I would be the focus of attention, at least for a moment. And that day was like insane chaos. There was a whole whirlpool of fights happening in the street. And again, the police weren't stepping in to stop it at all. Not until the governor declared it was a state emergency. And then they all dispersed and are just like marching through the streets to this other park. Like, it truly did feel lawless, and like they ran the town for that moment.
Ugh. And you write, you hinted at this in your answer, but you write that Charlottesville was like a nuclear disaster for the alt-right. Why?
Right. So I think radiation sickness is a good metaphor here. Is that, like, when you are poisoned by radiation, at first you get really familiar symptoms like nausea, right? But they're pretty mild. And then you enter the latency phase where it feels like you're getting better, but actually your cells are breaking down. And then after that, you enter the manifest illness stage, which is gruesome, and your body falls apart. And that is what happened to the alt-right. So they knew they'd taken some hits, some PR hits. They regrouped. They weren't quite sure what to do. And then they even got some more recruits for a while, for a couple months after that, like Identity Europa, one of the white polo frat. Mm-hmm. They got a lot of new recruits after that. But over time, the consequences started to build up to where it killed the movement. Like, they're kicked off social media. They were all named and shamed online. They were, most importantly, kicked off financial services companies online, so they couldn't raise money.
Yeah.
There was a point where Spencer was like, I can only take money through physical checks. And then they got sued, right? And if you can't raise money or rally people to your cause, and you can't afford a lawyer, like, that's going to have very negative legal consequences for you. and there's just infinite recriminations. That moment where Heimbach and Parrott fight each other over a woman, and there's an arrest, and that becomes known as the night of the wrong wives in that world. That happens in the aftermath of Charlottesville. Spencer gives a speech on a college campus in Michigan that goes so poorly. He does a YouTube where he says Antifa is winning. Like, all of it breaks apart. They all run away with their tail between their legs.
I think you characterized it really well in the book as well, when you said Charlottesville was the first kind of step off the internet, or this big step off the internet where like they could say whatever they wanted on these forums, be completely lawless. But as soon as you enter real life and reality, there are consequences for your actions.
Yeah. Once you enter physical space, there's a different set of rules that apply. Like, I don't like the idea that what happens on the internet isn't real. It is real, but it has a different laws of physics than out here. Yeah. Like, one of the ways I think about it sometimes is like this concept of tech disruption. Like, yeah, you can do all kinds of disruption or whatever when you're talking about sending ones and zeros over the internet through social media companies or apps or Uber, whatever. But that submersible, the submarine company, like they're trying to disrupt in the physical world, right? And they have to deal with the reality of like what, a mile of pressure of water will do to like a canister of steel, right? Like, boom, like you run into reality when you hit physical space, a different reality. Yeah. And that's what it was for them.
Moving on to another lighthearted topic, you were there on January 6th.
I sure was.
What the heck was that like, and what were you thinking?
It was the craziest shit I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
It was even crazier than Charlottesville because, like, in high school, I had gone to, like, all ages punk shows. I'd seen mosh pits. I didn't like it. Okay, I wasn't cool. I don't want to portray myself as that way, but, like, I'm used to seeing young men on the margins of society act a little crazy. But January 6th was like grown-ups, elders, people who clearly had jobs, like people who were wearing nice winter coats, people who could be like my aunt, and just seeing them so possessed by these ideas that I didn't feel like they even understood the origins of. Like, it's like they were just, mob mentality again. They were just like wild, like captured by this belief. CNN isn't thought of too well in that community, but I don't hide where I report for, because if they just find out later, then you're really in trouble. But I remember telling this woman I worked for CNN, she's this kind of like physically fit, I'd say like about 60 years old, wiry hair, cropped. She looked very nice. And just the way her face twisted up with rage, like I would just never forget it. It was so shocking in the moment. Like, I wasn't feeling like a corresponding anger or upset at her being mad at me, but horror at how the rage twisted up her face. So we heard they were like trying to break into the Capitol. We raced down Pennsylvania Avenue. We get to the Capitol, and again, you can feel the intention of the whole crowd goes to this one staircase, because it looks like that's the only way into the Capitol. And everyone starts pushing that way, stomping over bushes, whatever, climbing over retaining walls. So my crew and I like go over there, and there's just this push. We're standing on top of the wall. Some guy screams at us, either get over the wall or get out of the way. Like, these elderly couple are scrambling over it. This woman says of her husband, like, watch the cane. Like, it was like so crazy. And my producer, Sam Guff, she's very petite. I started to get scared. I was like, Sam, okay, if there is a stampede, no matter what, don't fall on the ground. Like, you must stay standing no matter what. She's like, I know what happened to Mufasa. So we move over to this other wall, and a lot of people, you've probably seen this footage of people like madly climbing up a wall to get into the Capitol. Okay, so that's our footage. Completely unnecessary. Like, I'm actually standing there thinking, like, do I need to climb this wall? And I hear some guy shout at this top, just go around, there's stairs. So, like, leisurely we walk around the corner of the Capitol and just cruise up the stairs, cruise past a couple cops and walk on. But like, that's how crazy people
Wow.
were. Like,
Yeah.
that's how crazy they're like. I thought they were going to fall down and hurt themselves. They're scaling this like 2-story wall. It was so insane. It was so insane.
That's
People
wild.
were stringing out because they'd been tear gassed or maced by the cops, and they're like genuinely upset that cops weren't on their side. Like, they didn't understand.
In your description, I think in the talking to specifically Richard Spencer after January 6th, he was talking about how he was, and also Parrott and I think Heimbach as well, that they were appalled
Yeah.
that, like the normal people were now red pilled, and you don't want too many normies or the masses to become red pilled.
Yeah.
They said we did Charlottesville, but they did January 6th.
Yeah.
If this is a movement that they're trying to spread, why don't they want the masses to be red pilled, and why are they distancing themselves from this
Well,
if
they
this is
used
what
to
they
think
started?
that. They used to think the masses should be red pilled, but then they saw the products of that. So they had talked quite glibly about fascism, about like changing the way our government is, about how they would exploit the First Amendment for now, but there wouldn't be a First Amendment when they were in power. Like, they had spoken about that very openly. But once they see this slightly different movement that has so many of the same characteristics actually do something much more radical than they had considered, they're appalled by it. I think there's a little bit of jealousy. Like, I've listened to podcasts where ex-alt-right guys are like, why wasn't it us? They're like upset that the movement, the online social movement behind Trump, are what they call the alt-light. So like your Tim Pools, like your Benny Johnsons, your Ben Shapiro's, like Charlie Kirk, like guys who are conservative, but they're not explicitly racist.
Mm-hmm.
And the alt-right guys like Spencer, they consider those people their intellectual inferiors. And they're like, so why was it them and not us? Like, we could have protected society. Like, we could have protected the Western Empire. And instead, it's in the hands of these idiots who are just stealing our memes from 10 years ago. And so I think it held up a mirror a little bit to what they had advocated for. Again, like a lot of that world all started off as a joke, and it becomes a more sincere belief. But then when you see it in real life, you're really confronted with what you've been talking about. You tend to see it in a whole new way. So, I mean, what Parrott would say to me was like, I actually respect the rule of law. Like, I actually think that's a good thing. I think the Constitution is a good thing. He said that he thought now normie conservatives were not as ideologically radical as he was, but much more tactically radical, and that he was afraid that they would win. Spencer said, like, when you red pill the masses, like, you don't get, this like white race that he had once talked about, like, an army of Chads, like a new age of Western civilization. Like, what you get is Ashley Babbitt being shot in the neck. Mm-hmm. You get QAnon. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They think they are much better than QAnon. Even though, so like they believed Jews were convincing women to have babies with people of color in order to suppress the white race. That's their great replacement, right? Mm-hmm. QAnon believes a cabal of pedophiles is like doing mind control in order to have child like slaves and cannibalism and that kind of thing, as well as import voters for the Democratic Party. Like, mm-hmm. The structures of these conspiracy theories are very, very similar. But the old Nazi guys, they think they're much better. They're a lot smarter than QAnon. They think QAnon is stupid boomerism.
Wow.
I mean, one of the crazy things is like going into January 6th, I got inside this Telegram channel where they were organizing going to Jan 6, and the people in there were talking about the normies getting red pilled. And I was just like watching this, like, you are the normie.
Yeah.
That's you.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Big question. Broadly, How is Black pilled culture seeping into the mainstream?
Oh, I mean, I think, oh my God, like it's scary to me. I mean, yeah, the idea of burn it all down. I mean, so there's been all this discourse about podcasts, right? And I love podcasts. I listen to them a lot, so I kind of love this discourse. But like, why aren't there big liberal podcasts the way there is Joe Rogan or Theo Vaughn, who had Trump on to talk about cocaine? And I was listening to Theo Vaughn recently, and at the very end of, like a normal, just like 2-hour podcast about not being able to get girls or using dick pills, he's like talking about how the number one cause of bankruptcy in America is medical debt, and how fucked up the system is, how terrible it is, and why hasn't there been any change? It's been so long and there's no change. And he's like, people are so sick of the system, you almost want a war to end it all or whatever, right? Like that kind of thinking. That's black pilled thinking. And like, it's everywhere. I mean, I interviewed these women who'd been radicalized during COVID because they thought schools should be open. Like they were living in blue states and there were very strict controls on when kids could go back to school. And to be fair, like in hindsight, they were right broadly, right? Like kids probably should have gone back to school. It was very bad for kids to go back to school, and they didn't spread COVID as much as adults. But like that really changed her. It had turned her from a liberal to a hardcore DeSantis supporter, and she called herself black pilled. Like it's just like this idea of everything is corrupt, burn it all down. Like when you would interview people, like I interviewed normal people who were excited about Donald Trump, or like they thought he said crazy stuff, or they thought Jan 6 was crazy, but they were desperate for some kind of change. They just want to like burn it all down. They don't want to defend institutions, right? The way like Democrats and moderate Republicans talked about this election. Mm-hmm. They want a huge shakeup. They want change. Maybe they're not able to find it in the best, healthiest places, but I mean, that's how desperate they are for it, I think.
Better than nothing, right?
Yeah.
What would you have written if you wanted to as an update to the book if you had finished it after the 2024 election?
Yeah, I'm working on that now.
Yeah, amazing.
The themes that I'm interested in is one has how this election was framed as a boys versus girls election, the massive gender gap, and where that comes from, and two, just the pervasiveness of this culture that I wrote about that was once so obscure, and how it is the foundation that like online political culture is built on now, and people will repeat ideas taken from there without even realizing it. So I was listening to Joe Rogan right after the election, and he was talking about how he'd been walking down the street with a guy who was a liberal that he called a cuck. Okay. So that was an alt-right term. Mm-hmm. Like that meant from cuckold, the idea, men who have women have sex with other men, right? That was their term for conservatives, that conservatives were letting in immigrants to have their way with America, right? So in that moment, is Joe Rogan thinking, I'm going to reference the alt-right now in this weird sexual explanation for immigration? Like, no, of course not. Of course he wasn't thinking that way. It's just like how like deeply embedded these ideas are, and how like this way of looking at politics through this lens of masculinity and like defending your masculinity and whatever policies you want are not about like how to make the world like marginally better year over year. Like they're about projecting strength and power and your identity as a man.
And finally, what message would you like readers to take away after reading Black Pill?
I want people to take away that for good and for ill, like little actions can have big effects down the road. Small movements, small changes in the culture can have a massive impact on society down the road. So when I was at Jan 6, again, people were extremely hostile to CNN, but if I wanted them to talk to me, I'd say, tell me what happened for history, right? Like we just got to get it all down, like say what happened, because these guys wanted to be part of history and they wanted to step forward and take their place in history. And they did, for the worse, right? But like they were willing to go forward and take that action. And I think I want regular people to understand like the danger of some of these ideas, but also that like you don't have to wait for your member of Congress to do something. Like you can take an action to change society for the better, right? Like stop just waiting around for Kamala Harris to rescue you. Like politics happens on your school board.
Yeah.
And one last thing, if your little cousin, your nephew, your son, especially women as well, but particularly the boys, are spending a lot of time on the internet, like you need to make them go outside and literally touch grass and like have conversations with those guys so they don't get lost in a very dark world that is bad for society, but also bad for them personally.
Yeah, absolutely. Recognizing the alt-right internet slang creep too, I think is a big part of that.
Listen, like when they get that little smirk on their face and like they say some slang you haven't heard of, like go ahead and go Google that. Don't just let it go. Like you screaming and yelling and sort of like a moralizing speech doesn't change minds, but don't just let it go either. Don't just play ignorant.
Yeah.
You know, there's actually phone calls with the guy who murdered a woman, James Alex Fields at Charlottesville, between him and his mother that were made public in this trial. And in the phone call, he's telling his mom how he wants Richard Spencer to be president. Like, don't be that mom.
Yeah. Say something, mom. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, say something before it's too late.
Elle, thank you so much. I learned so much, and this was awesome.
Oh, it was really fun talking to you. I really appreciate it. I had a good time.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare Materials supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfaremedia.org. The podcast is edited by Jen Patja, and your audio engineer this episode was Kara Schillen of Go Rodeo. Our theme song is from Alibi Music. And as always, thank you for listening.